My aunt died on a Tuesday in March, and by Thursday my cousin had already changed the locks on her house. I found out the same way I found out about everything in my family too late, and from someone who wasn't even involved. My coworker mentioned it casually over lunch, the way people do when they assume you already know. "Oh, I heard your aunt passed. I'm so sorry." I set down my fork and nodded like I'd known for days. I hadn't. Nobody had called me. That's the kind of family I come from. My aunt, my mother's older sister, had lived in a 4-bedroom house in Oakville, Ontario for 32 years. She never married, never had children of her own. She was the kind of woman who kept a garden even in November, who made her own jam, who remembered every birthday with a handwritten card. She was also the only person in my family who had ever treated me like I was worth something. When my parents divorced, I was 11. My mother moved us into her sister's basement for 8 months while she got back on her feet. My aunt never once made us feel like a burden. She fed us, helped me with homework, drove me to school when the buses were on strike. She taught me how to read a balance sheet when I was 15 because she said every woman should understand where her money goes. That was the kind of person she was. I'm 31 now. I work as a property assessor for a firm in Hamilton. I know buildings. I know what things are worth. My aunt knew that about me, and she respected it. My cousin, my aunt's nephew on her late husband's side, is 38. His name is Marcus. He lives in a condo in downtown Toronto and works in what he calls brand consulting, which as far as I can tell means he attaches his name to other people's ideas and takes a percentage. He drove a leased BMW and wore watches that cost more than my monthly rent. He visited my aunt maybe 4 times a year, always around holidays, always with a bottle of wine and a story about some deal he was closing. My aunt was polite to him because she was polite to everyone, but I knew her. She saw exactly what he was. The will reading was held the following Monday at a law office in Burlington. Marcus was already seated when I arrived, legs crossed, phone in hand. He didn't look up when I came in. The lawyer, a quiet man in his 60s named Mr. Garreau, waited until we were both settled before he opened the folder. My aunt had left the house in Oakville to Marcus. She had left me a storage property. Marcus didn't bother hiding his smile. He made a sound, almost a laugh, and leaned back in his chair like he'd just won something. The house in Oakville was worth somewhere between $1.3 and $1.5 million, depending on the market. Everyone in the room knew that. What my aunt had left me was a commercial storage unit on a property outside of Brantford. Mr. Garreau read the address. I wrote it down. Marcus was already texting someone. Before I left, Mr. Garreau handed me a sealed envelope. He said my aunt had asked that I receive it privately. Marcus glanced over and said nothing, but I saw his jaw tighten slightly. I waited until I was in my car to open it. Her handwriting was small and careful, the way it always was. "I know this doesn't look like what you wanted. I need you to trust me one more time. Go see it before you decide anything. You know how to look at a building the way most people never will. Use that. I love you more than I ever said. Aunt Carol." I sat in that parking lot for a long time. I drove to Brantford the next morning. The property was on a county road about 12 minutes outside the city. I almost missed the turnoff. The address led me to a gravel lane flanked by old maples, and at the end of it sat a squat, flat-roofed commercial building, maybe 4,000 square feet from the outside. Hard to tell exactly without measurements. The siding was original, probably from the 70s. The gutters had pulled away from the roofline on one side. There was a rusted padlock on the main roll-up door, and a smaller entrance with a deadbolt that the lawyer's package included a key for. I stood outside for a moment and just looked at it, the way my job has trained me to look at things not emotionally, not with disappointment, just structurally. The foundation looked solid. No visible settling. The roof was rough but not collapsed. The bones were there. What didn't make sense was the hydro bill. It had been included in the estate documents. The last 12 months of utility statements for the property. I'd glanced at them at the law office but hadn't really processed what I was seeing until I sat with them that morning before driving out. The average monthly hydro cost for this building, supposedly an empty storage unit, was running just over $340 a month. Some months higher. The previous July had been $490. An empty building doesn't use $340 a month in electricity. Not in Ontario. Not unless something is running inside it. I used the key and went in through the side entrance. The space inside was dim. A few high windows let in gray morning light. The floor was concrete, poured clean and level, better quality than the exterior suggested. There were shelving units along the east wall, mostly empty. Old moving blankets folded in a pile near the door. The smell was dry and faintly metallic. I walked the perimeter slowly. North wall, east wall, south wall. Then I got to the west end and stopped. The wall was wrong. I've been doing property assessment for 6 years. I've walked through hundreds of buildings. I know what a load-bearing wall looks like, what a partition looks like, what a finished exterior wall feels like when you put your hand on it in winter. This wall was none of those things. It was framed out in drywall, smooth and painted the same industrial gray as everything else, but it was set back about 18 inches from where the exterior wall should have been based on the outside dimensions I'd clocked when I pulled in. I knocked on it. Hollow. I went back to my car and got the measuring tape I keep in my work bag. I measured the interior length from the entrance to the false wall, 61 feet. Then I went outside and measured the exterior length of the building, 79 feet. 18 feet of space behind a wall that wasn't supposed to be there. I went back inside. I ran my hands along the drywall seams until I found one that didn't match. A vertical cut about 4 feet wide near the south corner, the kind of gap you'd make if you wanted a panel that could open. There was no handle, but there was a small slot near the base, the kind a bolt slides into. I crouched down and looked. The bolt was thrown from the inside. Someone had been in here. Someone had locked this from the inside and gone out another way. I stood up and thought about the hydro bill. I thought about my aunt's letter. You know how to look at a building the way most people never will. I found a gap in the baseboard along the adjacent wall and worked it loose. Behind it, running the length of the false partition, was a standard electrical conduit. Active. Something was drawing power back there. I called a locksmith. He arrived 45 minutes later, a quiet older man who didn't ask many questions. He had the panel open in under 10 minutes. He swung it outward and stepped back without a word. I stepped through. The hidden room ran the full 18 feet and the full width of the building. The floor was the same poured concrete, but cleaner. Someone had maintained this space deliberately. There were 2 rows of heavy-duty metal shelving and, on them, wooden crates stacked neatly and labeled in my aunt's handwriting. Along the far wall, under canvas covers secured with bungee cords, were 4 large shapes. I already knew what they were before I pulled the first cover off. Motorcycles. 3 of them. 2 under separate covers, 1 under a shared tarp with a 4th shape I couldn't make out yet. The first one I uncovered was a 1969 Honda CB 754, the first mass-production superbike, one of the most important motorcycles ever built. It was in what appeared to be original, unrestored condition. Not perfect, but honest, the kind of condition that collectors call survivor. The second was a 1972 Ducati 750 GT. I'm not a motorcycle person by any stretch, but I know how to look up values, and I knew enough to understand that what I was looking at was not ordinary. The third shape under the shared tarp turned out to be 2 things. A 1968 BSA Spitfire, and, beside it, covered separately with a moving blanket and 3 layers of bubble wrap held together with packing tape, a wooden crate about the size of a large suitcase. Inside the crate, nested in foam, was a collection of vintage racing memorabilia, photographs, programs, a leather racing jacket with patches I didn't recognize yet, and what appeared to be a hand-signed promotional poster in a sealed protective sleeve. On the shelf nearest the door, there was a binder. I opened it. My aunt had been meticulous. The binder contained provenance documentation for every item in the room, purchase receipts, restoration records where applicable, appraisal letters, photographs. The Honda CB 750 had been purchased at an estate auction in Guelph in 2003 for $1,800. She'd had it professionally assessed in 2019. The appraiser had valued it at $28,000 to $34,000 in its current condition. The Ducati had come to her through a private sale from a collector in Kitchener. Its 2021 appraisal letter estimated $45,000 to $60,000. The BSA had a murkier history, but a recent assessment pegged it between $18,000 and $25,000. The racing memorabilia crate was where things shifted. The leather jacket belonged to a Canadian motorcycle racer from the 1960s. I won't pretend I knew the name immediately. I had to read the documentation twice. But what the binder told me was that this particular racer had died young, that his personal effects had been largely dispersed or lost, and that authenticated items of his were considered significant within a specific collector community. The jacket had been authenticated by a specialist in 2022. The estimate in that letter read, $40,000 to $65,000 for the jacket alone, pending sale context. The signed poster, authenticated separately, was listed at $12,000 to $18,000. My aunt had spent 20 years quietly, carefully assembling this, and she had left it all to me. I sat down on the concrete floor of that hidden room with the binder in my lap, and I thought about every time Marcus had walked past her at Christmas without asking how she was doing. I thought about the way he'd smiled at the will reading. I thought about my aunt in her garden in November, patient, unhurried, tending things that took years to come up. I didn't cry. I'm not sure why. Maybe because I understood, finally, what she had been trying to tell me my whole life, that the things worth having are the ones other people don't bother to look for. I photographed everything. I measured everything. I made a detailed inventory using the format I use at work. Then I locked the panel, locked the building, and drove back to Hamilton. That evening I called 3 people. The first was a friend from university who now works as an estates lawyer in Mississauga. The second was a vintage motorcycle specialist I'd found through a collector's forum. He came highly recommended and was based in Cambridge, Ontario. The third was my contact at a major auction house with a Canadian office in Toronto. I'd worked with them once before on a commercial property assessment that had involved some antique equipment, and I trusted their process. The lawyer confirmed what I'd suspected. Because the property had been left to me outright, with no conditions attached, everything on it was legally mine. The contents of the building transferred with the building. My aunt had been smart about this. There was no separate listing of contents in the estate documents, no inventory attached to the will. The building was mine. What was in it was mine. The motorcycle specialist drove out the following Saturday. He spent 2 hours in the hidden room. When he came back out, he was very quiet for a moment, which I've learned is often a good sign with people who know things. He told me the Honda was in better condition than most surviving examples he'd seen. The Ducati was exceptional. He'd only personally handled 2 other 750 GTs in comparable shape. The BSA needed mechanical attention but was fundamentally sound. He gave me a conservative estimate for all 3 together, $110,000 to $140,000 at the right auction, with the Ducati likely being the headline piece. The auction house specialist came the week after. She was a composed woman in her early 50s who spoke carefully and carried a reference book I'd never seen before. She spent the most time with the memorabilia crate. When she called me that evening, she told me that pending full authentication confirmation on the jacket, she believed the collection had a realistic sale estimate of $95,000 to $130,000, and that there was a specialty auction in Montreal in late May that would be exactly the right venue. I did the math several times that week. Conservative total, somewhere between $205,000 and $270,000. Realistic total, if conditions were right, potentially higher. I told no one in my family. Marcus called me in early April. I hadn't spoken to him since the will reading. He was friendly in the way that people are friendly when they want something loose and casual, asking how I was doing. Mentioning that he was starting a renovation on the Oakville house, and was it a pain driving out to Brantford every so often to deal with that old storage unit? He was building towards something. I waited. He asked if I'd thought about selling it. I said I was still figuring things out. He said he might know someone who'd take it off my hands. The land alone might be worth something for development, he'd heard, and he could probably help me connect with the right people. Take care of the whole thing. He had contacts. You know how it is. I told him I appreciated it and that I'd let him know. I didn't call him back. The motorcycles went to the Montreal auction on a Saturday in late May. I drove up the night before and stayed in a hotel near the old port. The specialist from the auction house had prepared a detailed catalog entry for each piece, and the racing memorabilia had been given its own lot, which she had lobbied for specifically. She'd been right to. The Honda CB 750 sold for $31,500. The BSA Spitfire sold for $22,000. The Ducati 750 GT, after a bidding period that lasted longer than I expected, and involved 2 phone bidders I never saw, sold for $78,000. The racing memorabilia lot sold for $118,000. I stood in the back of that auction room in Montreal, and I did not make a sound. The total, after the auction house commission, came to just over $218,000. I deposited the funds and spent the next 3 weeks being very quiet and very careful. I worked my regular hours. I did my assessments. I kept the storage property and began the process of properly insuring it and updating the utilities to my name. My aunt had kept the hydro running on a minimal plan to maintain climate control in the hidden room, a detail so considered it made me have to stop and breathe when I figured it out. Marcus called twice more in June. I let both calls go to voicemail. He mentioned the storage property both times. The second message was less friendly than the first. On a Thursday in early July, I met with a mortgage broker and a commercial real estate agent I'd been referred to by my friend the estate's lawyer. I'd spent the previous month researching a specific kind of opportunity, a small, independently owned property assessment firm in the Hamilton-Brantford corridor whose owner was retiring and looking to sell. I'd known about it for 2 years. I'd always thought it was too far out of reach. It wasn't anymore. The acquisition closed in September. I called Marcus the following week. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting. I told him that I had decided to keep the storage property, that I was expanding my business and the building would be useful for equipment and record storage, and that I wanted him to know directly so he didn't hear it some other way. There was a pause. He asked if the old place had turned out to be worth something after all. I told him my aunt had always known what things were worth. She just hadn't always felt the need to explain herself to people who wouldn't listen anyway. He didn't say anything to that, I thanked him for calling and told him I hoped the renovation was going well. Then I hung up and went back to work. My aunt's garden in Oakville is probably gone now. Marcus doesn't strike me as the type to maintain a perennial bed through a renovation, but I've started a small one in the yard behind my office in Hamilton, nothing elaborate, just a few things that take patience and come back every year without being asked. She taught me that the most valuable things in any building are usually the ones nobody thought to look for. She taught me that knowing how to read a space, really read it, past the surface, past what someone wants you to see, is a skill that protects you in ways that are hard to explain until you need it. I needed it. I used it. She knew I would.